Most of you cannot communicate. I don't mean you're stupid. I mean you talk, and somehow nothing ever lands. You mistake speaking for communicating. They are not the same thing. A man can talk for an hour and communicate nothing at all, and I've watched it happen more times than I can count, in offices, in living rooms, in men trying to tell their own sons something important and watching the boy's eyes go flat halfway through. Here's what I know. Communication is not measured by what leaves your mouth. It's measured by what arrives in the other man's head. And most of you have spent your whole life grading yourselves on the wrong end of that transaction. I want to give you a number, because a claim lands harder with a figure attached. Across the years, I've spent watching people run meetings, run families, run their own businesses. I've asked hundreds of them a version of the same question. After an important conversation, did you actually check whether the other person understood what you meant, or did you simply assume it because you'd said your piece clearly by your own judgment? Almost every single one admitted they never checked. They simply assumed the transaction was complete the moment the talking stopped. Tonight, I'm going to give you 10 specific things, not theory. 10 things you can do starting tomorrow morning that change whether your words actually land or whether they just make noise on their way past somebody's ear. Stay with me. This one's going to sting a little before it helps. Let me ask you something plain. Think about the last important conversation you had. Not a pleasant one, an important one. Did the other person walk away understanding exactly what you meant? Or did they walk away with some rough shape of it, nodding along, and you found out later they'd gotten it wrong? Here's what I want you to notice. Most of you don't actually know the answer to that question because you never checked. You said your piece, you felt like you'd said it well, and you moved on, assuming understanding happened simply because talking happened. Those are two entirely different events, and confusing them has cost you more than you know. I want to give you a specific example of what that cost actually looks like, because it's easy to nod along with the idea without feeling the weight of it. A man tells his crew a deadline moved up. He says it once, clearly, by his own judgment, and moves on. 3 weeks later, half the crew is still working toward the old deadline, because what landed in their heads wasn't quite what he'd said. It was close enough that nobody thought to double-check, and that small gap between what he meant and what they heard turned into 3 wasted weeks nobody discovered until it was too late to fix cheaply. Think about a bridge for a minute, because there's an old truth here worth sitting with. A man can build a beautiful piece of engineering off his own riverbank. Solid foundation, good materials, every joint fitted exactly right, and if it doesn't reach the other side, it isn't a bridge, it's a pier. It's a very expensive, very well-built thing jutting out into empty air, and nobody on the other side of that river can use it for one single thing. I want to press this a step further, because it's the part people miss. A man standing on his own pier, admiring the workmanship, has no way of knowing, from where he's standing, that it doesn't reach the other side. From his angle, it looks exactly like a bridge. It's only the man stranded on the far bank, watching a structure end 30 feet short of where he's standing, who can see the difference clearly. And he rarely says anything about it, because pointing out someone else's unfinished bridge feels ruder than simply nodding and walking away confused. That's what most communication is. A pier. Beautifully built from your own side, admired by you, and never once reaching the man you were supposedly building it for. You can be eloquent. You can be technically correct. You can use impressive words and construct a very fine sentence, and none of that matters if the bridge doesn't reach the other bank. The whole game is landing on the other side, not building something impressive on your own. Let me tell you about a fellow I'll call Foster. Foster ran operations for a mid-sized distribution company back in the 70s. Sharp man, genuinely sharp, knew the business inside and out. And when he explained something, he explained it completely. Every angle covered, every contingency addressed, nothing left out. I want you to hear what Foster himself believed about his own approach, because it matters. He was proud of his thoroughness. He considered it a mark of respect for the people in that room, giving them the complete picture rather than some watered-down summary he assumed they couldn't handle. In his own mind, the length of his explanations was evidence of how seriously he took the people receiving them. Problem was, nobody could follow him. His explanations ran long, packed with detail most people in that room didn't need and couldn't hold on to. And by the time Foster finished laying out a plan, half the room had lost the thread somewhere around minute 4 and was simply nodding, hoping somebody else had caught what mattered. I want to give you a specific scene, because it illustrates the pattern better than the general description alone. In one particular meeting, Foster spent close to 20 minutes explaining a new inventory procedure. The reasoning behind every step, 3 alternative approaches he'd considered and rejected, the historical context of why the old procedure had failed. When he finished and asked for questions, a junior manager, hesitant, finally asked him to simply state, in one sentence, what was actually changing on Monday morning. Foster could do it. He just hadn't done it first, and by the time he did, most of the room had already tuned out somewhere in the historical context. I want to leave Foster standing at the head of that conference table, mid-explanation, watching faces go polite and distant, because what happened to him over the following years, and what happened to a woman I'll introduce you to shortly, who solved the identical problem in an entirely different way, is the whole content of what I'm giving you tonight. I'll come back to Foster. Here's the mechanism, and once you see it, you'll hear it in every conversation you have from here forward. The measure of communication was never how much you said, or how precisely you said it from your own point of view. It was always whether the specific thing in your head successfully became the same thing in the other man's head. That's the entire transaction. Everything else, vocabulary, thoroughness, eloquence, is just materials. It doesn't matter how good your materials are if the bridge never reaches the other bank. I want to name one further piece of this mechanism, because I think it's the part that fools capable men most often. A man's own understanding of what he said is not evidence of anything about whether the other person understood it. Those are 2 completely separate facts, and most men conflate them without ever noticing they've done it. Foster understood his own explanation perfectly. That understanding told him nothing whatsoever about what had actually landed in the room, and he never once thought to check the difference. Here's the single most important thing I'm going to tell you tonight, and everything else is decoration around it. You are not responsible for what you meant to say. You are responsible for what actually landed. A man who says something perfectly clear, by his own judgment, and watches the other person walk away confused, has not communicated well and made an unlucky mistake. He has failed to communicate, full stop, regardless of how correct his own sentence was. The confusion is not the listener's fault for not paying close enough attention. It's evidence the bridge came up short, and the man who built it needs to go back and build it again, differently, until it reaches. Read that back to yourself. Most of you have spent years blaming the other side of the river for not walking across a bridge that never actually reached them. I want you to sit with that for a second. Don't rush past it. Think about the last time somebody misunderstood you, and ask yourself honestly whether that was really their failure to listen or your failure to build all the way across. Now consider the other side of this, because a principle like this one only becomes real once you've watched someone live it correctly. There was a woman at that same company, different department, named Adelaide, who ran customer accounts. Adelaide was not, by any account, the smartest person in that building. She'd tell you that herself. But when Adelaide explained something, people understood it, every single time. I want you to understand how Adelaide herself described her own limitation, because it matters to what follows. She told me, plainly, that she'd never considered herself especially quick with figures or especially eloquent with language. What she had, she said, was a habit of genuinely wondering, before she opened her mouth, what the other person actually needed to hear rather than what she herself found interesting to say. That single habit, applied consistently over years, made her explanations considerably more effective than Foster's, despite Foster being, by any conventional measure, the more capable man in that building. Here's what she did differently, and it's smaller than you'd expect. Before she explained anything important, she asked one question first. What does this person already know? And what do they actually need out of this conversation? Not what did Adelaide want to say. What did the other person need to receive? Then she built the explanation specifically for that, cutting anything that didn't serve the other person's actual need, no matter how proud she was of the detail she was cutting. And when she finished, she didn't just ask if there were questions. She asked the other person to tell it back to her, in their own words, not as a test, as a check. If what came back matched what she'd meant, the bridge had landed. If it didn't, she knew immediately, while there was still time to fix it, rather than finding out 3 weeks later when the whole project went sideways because of a misunderstanding nobody caught in time. Foster's explanations were more thorough than Adelaide's. Foster's explanations were also, consistently, less useful, because thoroughness measured from his own side of the river never once guaranteed the bridge actually reached anybody. I want to talk now about why this is so hard to do, because I don't want you thinking Foster was foolish. He wasn't. Building your explanation around what you know, rather than what the other person needs, feels natural, because it's the only side of the conversation you can actually see clearly. you know what's in your own head. You don't automatically know what's missing from theirs, and figuring that out requires a specific kind of effort most people never learn to make. Actually imagining the conversation from the other man's side before you open your mouth. I want to name why this specific effort feels so unnatural to most men. It requires, for a moment, setting aside your own perspective entirely and occupying someone else's. And that's a genuinely uncomfortable thing to do, because it means admitting, if only to yourself, that your own way of understanding the subject isn't automatically the clearest way to explain it to somebody starting from a different place. Most men would rather explain thoroughly, from comfortable, familiar ground, than do the harder work of imagining unfamiliar ground. Here's something else worth naming. Thoroughness feels like generosity. A man explaining every detail believes he's giving the other person more, being more helpful, more complete. It rarely occurs to him that past a certain point, more detail doesn't help the other person. It buries them. The generosity Foster believed he was offering was, from the listener's side of that table, closer to a burden. All right, here are your 10. I'm going to give them to you straight, one at a time, and I want you to actually use these, not just nod along. Number 1. Say less. Cut your explanation in half before you deliver it, every single time, and see what survives. Foster's explanations would have landed better at half their length. Most explanations would. Try this literally, this week. Write down what you intend to say, count the sentences, and cut it to half that number before you say it out loud. Number 2. Ask before you answer. Adelaide's whole method started with a question about what the other person actually needed. Do that before you launch into your own explanation, every time, without exception. A simple, what's the actual question you're trying to answer, before you start explaining saves you from building an elaborate answer to a question nobody asked. Number 3. Use their words, not yours. If a customer calls something a problem, don't correct them to your own technical term. Speak back in the language they handed you. A bridge built out of the other man's own materials reaches him considerably faster than one built entirely out of yours. I've watched men lose a customer's trust in 30 seconds simply by replacing the customer's own plain description of trouble with some internal jargon meant to sound more precise. Number 4. Check for understanding, every time, on anything that matters. Ask them to say it back. Not because you doubt their intelligence, because you cannot see inside their head, and the only honest way to know whether the bridge landed is to watch them walk across it themselves. Adelaide's exact phrase was simple. Just so I know I explained that right, what's your understanding of what happens next? That single question caught more misunderstandings before they became expensive than anything else in her method. Number 5. Let the silence sit. Most men fill every pause with more words, out of nerves, out of habit. A pause after an important point gives it room to actually land. Filling it immediately with more talk just buries the point you were trying to make under the next one. Corwin, the fellow I'll tell you about shortly, learned this the hard way. He used to fill every silence with reassurance nobody had asked for, right up until the moment he learned that silence was doing more work than his reassurance ever had. Now, some of you are sitting there thinking this is a lot to remember all at once. It isn't. You don't need to master 10 things by tomorrow morning. You need to pick one, the one that stung the most just now, and get good at that one before you worry about the rest. A man who genuinely fixes one habit out of these 10 is already ahead of most of the room. Number 6, match your tone to the moment, not to your own mood. A man delivering bad news in the same breezy tone he'd use for good news isn't communicating honestly. He's communicating his own discomfort with the moment, dressed up as casualness. If the news is serious, let your voice carry that seriousness. Pretending otherwise doesn't spare anyone. It just adds confusion about whether they should actually be worried on top of whatever they're already dealing with. Number 7. Tell them what's in it for them before you tell them what you need from them. Most people listen for their own stake in a conversation before they listen for yours. Give them that first, plainly, and the rest of what you say gets heard considerably better. A request that opens with what the other person gains gets a different quality of attention than one that opens with what you need from them, even when the actual request is identical. Number 8. Say the hard thing plainly. Don't wrap difficult news in so much padding that the actual point gets lost inside the cushioning. A man who takes 5 minutes to say something that should have taken 30 seconds isn't being kind. He's making the other person do the work of finding the point himself, while they sit there, growing more anxious with every sentence that isn't the actual news, wondering how bad it must be if it's taking this long to say. Number 9. Watch the other person's face, not your own next sentence. Most men, mid-explanation, are already composing what they'll say next instead of reading what's happening on the listener's face right now. That face is telling you, in real time, whether the bridge is landing. Most men never look. A furrowed brow, a slight nod that doesn't quite reach the eyes, a question forming that never gets asked because you never paused long enough to notice it forming. All of it is information, available for free, and most men talk right past it. Number 10. Follow up. Communication doesn't end the moment you stop talking. A brief follow-up, a day or two later, confirming the point actually held, catches the misunderstandings that don't reveal themselves until later, when they're considerably more expensive to fix. Adelaide made this a habit on anything that genuinely mattered. A short question, a day or two after the fact, just confirming the understanding had held. It cost her almost nothing. It saved her, more than once, from a small misunderstanding growing into a large and expensive one. I anticipate a few objections, and I'll answer them straight. First, doesn't asking someone to repeat things back feel condescending, like you're testing a child? It can, if you do it clumsily. Ask it as genuine curiosity about whether you explained it well, not as a test of their comprehension, and it lands entirely differently. Adelaide never once made anyone feel small asking this question. She made them feel like she genuinely cared whether her own explanation had done its job. Second, isn't cutting your explanation short risking leaving out something important? This is a fair concern, and I want to answer it directly. Cutting for length isn't the same as cutting for content. You're not removing the necessary parts. You're removing the parts that exist for your own comfort rather than the listener's actual need. The extra detail, the extra qualification, the extra explaining of things they already understood. What remains, cut properly, is usually more complete in the way that matters, not less. Third, and I regard this one as serious. What about a listener who genuinely doesn't want to engage, who won't answer honestly when you check for understanding? You'll meet these people. Not every bridge finds a willing traveler on the other side. But I want you to notice something. Even in that case, the method I've given you tonight still tells you something true. That the bridge didn't land, and no amount of talking longer or louder is going to fix a listener who's decided not to cross. That's genuinely useful information, even when it isn't the answer you wanted. Fourth, what about a man who genuinely struggles to find the right words in the moment, even when he understands exactly what he wants to say? I want to answer this one directly, because it's a real and common concern, distinct from the others. Nothing in what I've given you tonight requires natural eloquence. Adelaide told me herself she wasn't especially gifted with language. What she had was a habit, not a talent. Asking the right question first, cutting to the essential point, checking whether it landed. A man who stumbles over his words but genuinely does those three things will communicate considerably better than a naturally smooth talker who skips all three. The words matter less than most men assume. The habit matters more. I want to give you one more case before I get to Corwin, because it fills in a piece the others don't quite reach. There was a salesman I'll call Denny, worked for a farm equipment dealer in that same decade, who genuinely believed his job was talking. He'd walk a customer around a piece of machinery for 20 straight minutes, covering every feature, every specification, every advantage over the competitor's model, barely pausing for breath, let alone for a question. I want you to understand what actually happened to Denny's sales numbers, because it's the part that surprised even Denny himself when he finally looked closely at it. He wasn't a poor salesman by any obvious measure. He closed his share of deals, but he closed considerably fewer than a quieter colleague working the same territory, a fellow who talked less than half as much as Denny did in any given customer conversation. Denny finally asked this colleague, directly, what he was doing differently, expecting to hear about some closing technique or a particular phrase that sealed deals. The colleague told him something simpler than that. He said he spent most of the conversation asking the customer what problem they were actually trying to solve on their own land, with their own crop, in their own season. And then he only talked about the specific features that answered that actual problem, skipping past everything else entirely, regardless of how impressive the rest of the machine's specifications happened to be. Denny tried it the following week, nervously, because it felt, at first, like doing less than his job required. He asked one farmer what his actual trouble was, rather than launching straight into his usual walkthrough. The farmer talked for nearly 5 minutes about a specific issue with soil compaction on one particular field. Denny, instead of covering the whole machine, spoke for perhaps 90 seconds, addressing only the one feature that solved that exact problem. He closed that sale in under 10 minutes, the fastest close he'd had in over a year, And he told me later that the machine he'd sold hadn't been his most expensive model or his most impressive. It had simply been the one that actually answered the question the farmer had walked in with, which Denny had never once bothered asking before that particular week. I want to tell you about one more person before we close, because his story ties all of this together. There was a young man named Corwin, worked as a shift supervisor at a manufacturing plant, who had to deliver a hard message to his crew, a schedule change nobody was going to like. He'd watched Foster's style up close for 2 years and, without really planning to, had picked up every one of Foster's habits. Long explanations, every justification laid out in exhaustive detail, hoping thoroughness would soften the blow. It didn't. His crew left that meeting more confused and more resentful than if he'd said nothing at all, because somewhere inside all that explaining, the actual point. Here's what's changing, here's when, here's why, had gotten buried. I want to give you the specific detail of what changed for Corwin, because it's the whole lesson in miniature. He told me he genuinely believed, at the time, that his lengthy explanation was a form of respect for his crew, treating them as people who deserved the full picture rather than a bare announcement. What he learned, watching their faces afterward, was that his crew hadn't experienced it as respect at all. They'd experienced it as a man too uncomfortable with the news to simply deliver it, hiding behind explanation the way a nervous man hides behind small talk. 6 months later, facing a similar announcement, Corwin tried it differently. He said the change in one sentence. He said the reason in one more. Then he asked, directly, what questions they had, and actually waited for the answers instead of talking over the silence. The meeting ran 4 minutes. His crew walked out of it, by his own account, calmer than they'd walked into it, because for the first time, they'd actually understood exactly what was happening, instead of guessing at it through a fog of explanation. I told you at the opening tonight that most of you cannot communicate, and I promise to show you exactly why, and exactly what to do about it. Here's what I'm asking you to do before you sleep tonight. Think of the next important conversation on your calendar. Before you have it, write down, in one sentence, exactly what you need the other person to walk away understanding. Then build everything you say specifically toward landing that one sentence, cutting anything that doesn't serve it, and check, before the conversation ends, whether it actually landed. I want to leave you with one final thought, because I think it matters more than any single tip I've given you tonight. Every one of these 10 habits costs you something in the moment. The discomfort of asking a question instead of demonstrating your knowledge, the discomfort of silence instead of filling it, the discomfort of finding out, honestly, that your explanation didn't land the way you thought it did. Every one of them also costs you considerably less than what Foster paid, year after year, in meetings nobody could follow and decisions made without him, because people had simply stopped waiting for him to finish explaining. Foster eventually learned this, later than he needed to, and told me the change wasn't about becoming a different kind of man. It was about building his explanations from the other man's side of the river instead of his own. You don't need to be the most eloquent man in the room. You need only to make sure the bridge you're building actually reaches the other bank, one clear sentence at a time. Thank you.